Welcome to This Explainer. There is just so much noise out there right now about the Russia-Ukraine conflict. But our goal today is pure clarity. We are going to cut through the static and break down the complex historical, political, and economic factors driving this war using only the grounded facts from our source material. By the end of this explainer, you'll have a really solid, structured understanding of exactly how we got here and what it actually means for the globe.
Okay, let's just dive right in. The absolutely fundamental question at the heart of this whole thing is, why is Ukraine so incredibly vital to Russia? Well, look at a map. Ukraine isn't just some random country. It's the second largest in Europe by land area, right behind Russia itself. For a very, very long time, it was this deeply connected part of the USSR. It wasn't until the Soviet Union fell apart in 1991 that Ukraine became its own independent nation. But even though those borders were drawn over 30 years ago, Ukraine's physical location, sharing borders with Russia, Belarus, Poland, and sitting right there on the Black Sea, makes it absolutely crucial to Moscow's geopolitical vision.
So here is our roadmap for today. We're going to cover geography and history, NATO and EU expansion, internal fractures, the 2022 invasion, the global economic impact, and finally, the international response.
All right, kicking things off with Section 1, Geography and Historical Ties.
To really grasp what's going on, we kind of need to understand this term, oblast. It basically just means an administrative province. But why does that matter here? Well, in Ukraine's eastern Donbass region, you've got two specific oblasts, Luhansk and Donetsk. And the desires of the people living there created some serious early friction. You see, while a lot of Western Ukraine wanted to integrate with the European Union, many folks in these eastern oblasts actually wanted to join a Eurasian customs union headed up by Russia. This fundamental disagreement over which way the country should face, east or west, really laid the groundwork for major internal conflict.
There's a quote from our sources that just brilliantly hits the nail on the head regarding the stakes for Russia. It goes, "Russia, along with Ukraine, is a supreme power. Russia without Ukraine is just a big nation." Think about that for a second. It perfectly highlights exactly why that 1991 separation hit Moscow so incredibly hard. Without the massive agricultural lands, the vital Black Sea ports, and just the sheer geographic buffer that Ukraine provides, Russia's status on the world stage fundamentally shifts. In their historical view, Ukraine is a vital ingredient for true superpower status.
Moving right along to Section 2, NATO and EU expansion. So looking at how NATO evolved is absolutely crucial here. Remember, NATO was originally formed way back in 1949 by capitalist countries for collective security during the Cold War. But long after the Cold War ended, NATO just kept expanding east. By 1999, you had former communist-influenced countries joining up. Then, in 2004, Baltic states, right on Russia's literal doorstep, got admitted. But the real breaking point, the ultimate red line for Moscow, was in 2008 at the Bucharest summit, when NATO made a formal declaration of intent to eventually include both Ukraine and Georgia. And it wasn't just NATO, right? Ukraine was also pushing really hard to join the European Union. Now, getting EU membership isn't some overnight thing. It is a rigorous, multi-step process. Ukraine had to actively work to adopt a free market economy, stabilize their democracy, overhaul their laws to match EU legislations, and they even planned to adopt the euro. This slow, deliberate pivot away from Russia and toward Western economic integration just added massive fuel to the fire. Which brings us to Section 3, Internal Fractures and Revolutions. Inside Ukraine, things were getting incredibly tense in the early 2000s. You basically had a national tug-of-war between two guys. On one side, Viktor Yushchenko, who championed a pro-Western path. On the other, Viktor Yanukovych, a pro-Russian leader heavily backed by Vladimir Putin. When Yanukovych was initially declared the winner of a highly contested election, the public was outraged. We're talking massive protests, which became known as the Orange Revolution. The Ukrainian Supreme Court actually invalidated that election entirely, and Yushchenko won the revote. According to our sources, this was seen as a massive political blow to Putin. Fast forward to 2014, and things literally reach a boiling point. Yanukovych is back in power, and he abruptly scraps a huge, long-awaited EU deal to pivot back to Russia. Well, this triggered the massive Euromaidan protests, essentially forcing him to flee the country. Around the exact same time, a super controversial language law passed that restricted Russian to merely a regional status, which deeply alienated Russian speakers in the East. Capitalizing on all this chaos, Russia quickly supported a highly contentious referendum on March 16th, and literally 2 days later, they officially annexed the Crimean Peninsula, boom, just like that, and simultaneously, military aggression kicked off in the eastern Donbas region. Okay,
jumping into Section 4, the 2022 invasion. All of that historical and internal pressure finally exploded on February 24th, 2022. Russia launches this massive, multi-pronged missile and artillery attack across several Ukrainian cities. Now, our source material points out that Putin actually explicitly claimed his military had no intention of conquering the whole country. He said he was just targeting the leadership, or what he called the junta, in Kyiv, not everyday civilians. To set the stage, Russia officially recognized those rebel-controlled Donbass and Luhansk regions as independent. In immediate response, President Zelensky declared martial law, begged the world for sanctions, and literally started handing out AK-47s to citizens. The resistance was unbelievable. Everyday folks, volunteers, fighting off Russian advances with homemade Molotov cocktails. When both sides eventually sat down for some initial peace talks over in Belarus, it was a total stalemate. Their starting demands were completely, diametrically opposed. Russia wanted an ironclad guarantee of Ukrainian neutrality, meaning absolutely no NATO, and for the West to officially recognize Crimea as Russian. Ukraine, they just wanted an immediate ceasefire and for every single Russian soldier to leave their territory. There was literally zero middle ground. Now let's zoom out a bit for a Section 5 global economic impact. You know, the global stakes of this war are astronomically high. There's a reason Ukraine is known in geography as the breadbasket of Europe. Both of these countries are absolute juggernauts for global exports. Russia is pumping out wheat, fertilizers, natural gas, which Europe desperately relies on, and arms. Meanwhile, Ukraine is a massive exporter of sunflower oil, corn, and sugar beet. I mean, the whole world heavily relies on these two for the absolute basics of agricultural and energy supplies. It's like a giant economic house of cards. And man, did those cards fall fast. Because of how deeply integrated they are into the global supply chain, the immediate economic shockwave was huge. Just to put that into perspective, our source highlights how the Russian ruble crashed, losing up to 40% of its value against the dollar almost overnight, as global panic and early sanctions kicked in.
But as this war grinds on, we aren't just looking at a localized issue. We're talking severe, cascading global problems. Surging global food insecurity because massive shipments of wheat and oil are disrupted. That means spiking prices for basic groceries everywhere for all of us. On top of that, there's the ever-present threat of a complete cutoff of Russian natural gas to Europe, pointing toward a dire energy crisis, all while neighboring countries are scrambling to handle a sudden, massive influx of refugees.
And that brings us to Section 6, the international response.
Almost instantly, this complex web of global alliances just lit up. On one side, you've got Russia, backed by nations like Belarus, China, Iran, and Kazakhstan. On the other, Ukraine is getting massive backing from NATO nations, Japan, South Korea, and Australia. But what's truly fascinating here is the neutral stance taken by countries like India. India navigated this super delicate diplomatic tightrope because it maintains good relations with both sides, ultimately focusing its immediate efforts on Operation Ganga, a massive logistical mission just to safely evacuate its stranded students out of the conflict zone.
Now, here's a really fascinating geopolitical lever, the Montreux Convention of 1936. This is an almost century-old agreement that actually gives Turkey the legal international power to control warships passing through key straits into the Black Sea. So by officially recognizing this conflict as a war, Turkey effectively banned Russian warships from crossing. It's wild to see how historical legal frameworks can instantly become critical strategic weapons in modern warfare.
The international retaliation was incredibly swift, hitting almost every single sector you can think of. Economically, Russian banks got booted from the vital SWIFT financial system. Diplomatically, the UN General Assembly held a super rare emergency session. Militarily, we saw historic shifts, like Germany actually reversing decades of policy to boost its defense spending over 2% of GDP. It even bled into sports and culture. Russia got banned from the 2022 World Cup qualifiers, and Putin himself, who our source notes is a highly skilled judoka, got suspended as the honorary president of the International Judo Federation. They really went after the whole shebang. We really have to pause and remember that beyond all these complex economics and high-level politics, the human cost of this conflict is absolutely staggering. Almost immediately, over 5 lakh, that's 500,000 Ukrainians had to rapidly flee their homes. They poured across borders into neighboring countries like Poland, Hungary, Moldova, and Romania, triggering one of Europe's most severe humanitarian and refugee crises in modern history. To wrap up our explainer today, I really want to leave you with a pivotal question to chew on. We've seen how deeply rooted the history is, how volatile the borders are, and how fast a regional war can disrupt food and energy supplies for the entire planet. So, as these historical alliances shift and the global economy strains under all this immense pressure, how will the ripple effects of this conflict fundamentally reshape the balance of world power for decades to come? It is a massive question. But having walked through all the facts today, you are for sure much better equipped to follow this evolving story and find the answer. Keep learning, keep asking questions, and hey, thank you so much for joining me today.